15 minutes past the 8 o'clock hour, and Chris Lenois back with you on the Green Mountain Mornings program. Spending the remainder of today's program, however, with Mike Faher here in the studio, staff reporter for VTDigger, The Commons, and the Brattleboro Reformer. How you doing, Mike?
I'm good, thanks.
Although here today, I'm just going to call you my Vernon correspondent.
Sounds
because pretty much every different item that we're going to cover today, which you can find in the pages of the Brattleboro Reformer, a new look for the Brattleboro Reformer this morning, we should mention as well, although we're not going to be talking about any of the stories in there. But all these stories having to do with Vernon in some way, shape, or form. The first story, probably the least, when we're talking about the new superintendent for Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union, Lyle Holliday, named to the position, and then some dissent. You covered this in the weekend edition of the Brattleboro Reformer. Wednesday night's meeting last week, you were there?
Right.
So set the scene for us here. How exactly did this come up? Had they introduced Holiday, and then all of a sudden some people just start saying, WTF? What happened?
Well, it was interesting because most of the debate actually happened before her name was put out there in public, before they actually hired her. Prior to that meeting, the Finance Committee of Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union had recommended her hiring, and then it was up to the full board to actually hire her. Well, folks got wind of this, but it was still sort of, the name wasn't being widely circulated. All this stuff is confidential until someone's actually hired. But a lot of folks showed up to debate how that process played out. Not so much her credentials, but, how she was put forth as a candidate.
Right. Well, maybe the names of the candidates aren't put out there in public, but the process certainly was. In your story, you referenced that the decision was made by the board to only look at internal candidates, and that was really the gist of a lot of the dissent as early as June in the process. So was there dissent at that time, or is this the first time people were kind of coming forward and expressing concern about the process?
There's been some folks some residents who've been involved for the last few months, writing letters and things like that. As I understand it, Wednesday's meeting was the first time that there was a lot of vocal dissent, a lot of debate about the process back and forth. Although I should say that the various boards within Wyndham Southeast, apparently there's been a lot of debate in open session and in executive session over the past several months, maybe longer, about how this process was happening. It was not clear to me, even Wednesday night. The contention was made at one point that every single board had endorsed this internal search. And then there was some disagreement about that.
Meaning all the town boards?
Exactly.
Part of the supervisory
Vernon,
union?
Dummerston, Guilford had all said at some point, sure, we like this process. And that may well be, but then specifically Dan Normando from the Dummerston board said, well, there was a meeting where that wasn't quite the case for us. So...
and he was one of the people voicing his dissent. Mike Hebert, chair of the Vernon School Board, did he agree with that assessment on Wednesday, or...?
I think what Mike said was that they felt that their board in Vernon was not adequately informed. He said he would ask a lot of questions about, well, how many candidates do you have? Where are you in the process? What's going on? And he wasn't getting many answers. I suppose that means even in executive session, although, members of the public wouldn't have been privy to that anyway.
Right. Bottom line, this is not a breach of any sort of guideline or rule in terms of what they do for searches, right? I mean, they are perfectly within their rights to only do a candidate or a candidate search from internal candidates. They don't have to open this up to any kind of process statewide, nationwide.
Yeah, in fact, the Wyndham Southeast folks made a big point of saying, we consulted with Vermont Superintendents Association, Vermont School Boards Association. We talked with other, colleagues in other supervisory unions who've gone through this process. Not only is it legal, it's common.
It is. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's something, well, and a lot of the conversation that you covered in your Saturday report had to do with the reasons why, the things that they thought were better about doing just an internal search.
Right. They talk about, a culture of growth, the idea that when you promote from within, folks know that there's some room for advancement. That would be the case here. They talk about continuity, especially when you have these really difficult decisions coming up with Act 46 and potential mergers, things like that. And in the end, I should note that no one is disputing the new superintendent's credentials here at all.
Okay, yeah, that was a question. Does anybody have any concerns about Lyle Holliday?
Yeah, not that I heard. Again, it was a strange discussion because no one was outright discussing her during the debate because she hadn't been hired yet.
Was she sitting there?
No,
No,
at least
she
not
wasn't
that
at
I
the
saw in the
meeting. Okay.
room. She may have been in the building, but and even after the fact, apparently Mike Hebert was one of the folks who talked to me afterward, and he said, "Look, I'm not voting against Lyle Holiday here. I voted against the process."
Right. Well, and you bring up Mike Hebert, and we'll get to the story about Vernon withdrawing from Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union in a little bit. But then the other two voices in dissent, Jody Normandeau and Dan Normandeau, two people who have been very much against this Act 46 process. Mm-hmm. You wonder what they know about Lyle Holiday and how she feels about district unification, about Act 46, if that's fueling some of their dissent. I mean, they can say it's all about process, but come on. At some point, it also has to be about what you think that this superintendent is going to support as far as the direction of the schools. I suppose that could be. I wouldn't want to speculate myself on what the motivations are. I know Act 46 is a big issue, and certainly there's been some dissatisfaction with how the leadership of the supervisory union has pursued that. There's some folks who have very much favored that process too. And I should note too that it went beyond that. There were some folks in the audience from Brattleboro. There was a teacher in the supervisory union. I believe I'm not going to have the name here in front of me, but there were several other folks who spoke against the process for various reasons. Basically, they said, "You may well have the best candidate. How can you know that?" Right. If you haven't looked at anyone else. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And it was a case where it's not that they looked only internally. Was Lyle Holiday the only candidate that they looked at? It sounds to me that way. Yeah, I mean, we can't know for sure because it's all under executive session. But if that's the case, you can sort of understand, how can you only look at one candidate and say you have the best candidate? And certainly it's my understanding that there was only one candidate put forth for a vote on Wednesday night for the Supervisory Union Board. Right, and that vote was 13-5. Correct. So there were concerns even in that group about the process, perhaps. And again, it doesn't seem like anybody was concerned about Lyle Holiday. And we don't know anything about Lyle Holiday. We know her academic credentials, but we don't know her thoughts on Act 46 or any of this sort of political business at this point, do we? Yeah, and it's an interesting dynamic, too, because she does not take this position until July 1. And by that point, there'll have been a vote to merge these schools or not merge these schools, to leave Vernon out of the union or not leave it out of the union. A lot of these things are going to happen before she even takes that job. That's a very good point. And by the way, as a closing thought, she is taking the job. This is a done deal. People can rail against the process all they want, but it's not like there's a do-over here. Yeah, I mean, it could have been at the end of that meeting last Wednesday night that the board came out of executive session and said, well, we'll reopen the process, but that didn't happen. Right. So come July 1, Lyle Holiday will be the new superintendent of Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union. Whatever schools are part of that union now remains to be seen. We'll be talking about that with Mike Faher, as well as other stories found on VTDigger, the Brattleboro Reformer, and in the Commons. You can give us a call here, 802-254-5286, if you want to weigh in on any of these topics. Bottom of the hour news break coming up next. And 30 degrees outside at 21 minutes before the 9 o'clock hour. Chris Lenois back on the Green Mountain Mornings program and continuing my conversation with Mike Faher. News that you'll find in the Brattleboro Reformer as well as on VTDigger and presumably in the Commons. And some of these stories have been in the Commons. Mike contributing content to all of those media outlets here in the state of Vermont and to the Green Mountain Mornings program. Really appreciate you alternating now with Chris Mays every other Tuesday, Mike, and coming in here and talking about some of the stories you're covering. We spoke about the Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union superintendent search in that first segment. This happened at a different meeting, if I understand correctly. Another story you had about the WSESU and Vernon saying a deal is in place for them to withdraw from the union. That was at a different meeting in the same week?
Yeah, earlier in the week, there was a joint meeting between the Vernon and the BUHS board, and they approved this withdrawal agreement that would let Vernon exit from the supervisory union next year.
Now, the voters of Vernon already voted on this back during the primary in August. Did this just clarify the terms and in terms of what the terms are in which they withdraw?
Yeah, I think they're sort of going into uncharted territory here. Apparently, there's not been under the current regulatory education law set up a district that just bailed from its supervisory union, or I should say from its regional union this way. And so, yes, Vernon in August voted to withdraw. The other towns still have to vote to let them withdraw. Apparently, that's going to happen next month. But the details are what this agreement has to do with. How do we actually make this happen? How do we make sure that no one's hurt financially on either side by sort of getting rid of this long-time agreement, operating agreement?
And the details are very difficult to encapsulate.
Yeah.
And this has been a very confusing issue for a lot of people, just wondering how can a town like Vernon just withdraw from a school district? After I reported on social media on that vote on primary day, and I had friends of mine on Facebook who are all over the country as well as other parts of the state saying, wait a minute, how can Vernon even do that? Where are the students in Vernon going to go to school? Now, they can still go to BUHS under this new deal, right?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, they say that ideally not much will change day to day for the folks in Vernon. A majority of Vernon students still go to Brattleboro. Some don't. Some go to Massachusetts.
I think about 70% is what Mike had said.
And they'll still be able to do that if Vernon withdraws. It'll simply be under a tuition agreement as opposed to, being members of the union.
Right. And I should say Mike Hebert because you're Mike Faher. That's when I said what Mike had said. That would be the Vernon School Board chair who I had in here to talk a little bit about this. Now, Mike Hebert, obviously, and the rest of the Vernon voters consider this a win. They like the idea that they're going to be able to preserve school choice. They like the idea that they're going to maintain more local control. Does the WSESU consider this a loss?
Not that I've heard. Again, this goes back to Act 46. There were all those Act 46 talks about let's bring all the districts in WSESU together. Vernon said, nah, we don't think so because we're worried about losing our school choice. And so what this would allow is Vernon to go its own way, and the other districts can continue to talk about a merger. In fact, the plan is to vote next town meeting day to merge the other districts.
Right, and I believe they've put out a public statement, maybe not an official statement, but I've heard members of the Act 46 committee saying, we don't really think it's in our best interest to stand in the way of Vernon if this is what they want to do. Is that vote on November 8th, or is that vote select board meeting day?
Well,
or town meeting day, excuse me.
So that's part of the complexity here.
Right.
There's a vote in the other towns to let Vernon out, and as of last week, that had tentatively been set for December 13th.
Okay. That's right. It's no longer on the ballot for next week. It's a little bit later on.
Right, and then there wouldn't be the merger vote in the other towns to merge those districts until town meeting day. They had talked about doing all of this on November 8th.
Right.
And the town clerks said this is way too much. There was also some concern from the state saying you're really going to confuse the voters, asking them to weigh in on Vernon exiting the union and then merging the other districts. It could be a real mess. Yeah,
well, now the state is the final arbiter in this situation, if I understand correctly. We've already seen the Education Secretary, Rebecca Holcomb, reject a plan over there in the Deerfield Valley, one of the school systems there, as far as what they wanted to do. Any reason to think that they would look disapprovingly on this plan? And when you say a framework is in place in this article that you wrote, and it's in the Friday edition of the Reformer, that framework is between us all here in Windham County, nothing to do with Montpelier.
Right. I mean, certainly it's the State Board of Education's job, as well as the Agency of Education, to make sure that nobody's coming up with an agreement that is not in the best interest of the students here. I will say that the folks in Windham Southeast have been working with the state every step of the way in this process. There's no one at the Agency of Education that's not aware that this is going on. Theoretically, none of this should be a surprise.
Right, right. Yeah, that matters for sure to have their buy-in on this because they're the ones who are going to judge on it. Is that something that they anticipate happening after the December vote, I would imagine?
Right. The other towns would vote to let Vernon out, and then early 2017, I believe, would be when the state review would happen.
Right.
There's so many moving parts.
There really is. I'm glad you're the one on top of it. I can just ask you questions about it. Moving from local versus state to state versus federal here with a story you had in the weekend edition of the Reformer having to do with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission ruling against a complaint from the state of Vermont regarding Entergy VY's use of the decommissioning fund. Vermont had asked for a comprehensive review. Basically, the ruling from Entergy was saying that Entergy VY is in compliance. But what I wasn't clear on. Was it that they were in compliance, or were they with what they're supposed to be doing with the decommissioning fund, or was it more of just NRC saying, hey, you don't have an opportunity, state of Vermont, to even question how we're handling this process?
I think it's a little of both.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the NRC is the one that has granted Vermont Yankee various permissions and exemptions to use this trust fund, most notably for the long-term management of all that radioactive spent fuel on site. And the state said, we don't like some of the ways in which Vermont Yankee is spending this money, and we want a federal review of this. We want a hearing. We want to be able to object. And this was the NRC saying, nah, not really. This is our purview. Our regulations are adequate, and we're not going to give you a hearing.
Right.
Yeah.
So like you said, a little bit of, they said, we feel that we are doing this review. That wasn't part of it. It wasn't just saying, hey, Vermont, you don't even have the right to ask.
Yeah, the NRC says, look, there are federal guidelines that mandate that the fund be at certain levels. We do annual reviews, and if we find that the funds are deficient, we will order the licensee, in this case Entergy, to bring the fund up to where it should be. But you as the state don't have any role in that.
Right. Yeah. Now, the lead sentence actually said the NRC mostly rejected the complaint from the state of Vermont. What part did they accept?
Yeah, it's so there's this. The state was also asking for environmental reviews, again associated with trust fund usage at the plant, and the NRC largely said nah. But they did order this environmental review. Bear with me here, associated with the exemption that had been granted, allowing VY to spend trust fund money on spent fuel management.
I think I followed that.
And so, what that really means, I'm not sure. The state saw it as sort of a partial victory, but when I talked with Entergy, they said, yeah, we don't see that it's going to change anything that we're doing.
I guess it comes down to what the scope of that environmental review is. Is it just the plant? Is it outside of the plant? When we're talking about groundwater, when we're talking about the Connecticut River, we don't have any guidance on what this environmental review that they've said, yeah, okay, we'll do that, encompasses.
Yeah, and I guess I don't have a clear idea of it either. As I understand it, the NRC staff in granting that exemption had basically said, you don't need to do one of these environmental reviews. This was the NRC staff. And this was the commissioners saying, well, gee, we've looked at this and, we haven't identified any actual concern, but we think that procedurally we should have done one of these reviews before we granted the exemption, so we're going to do it now.
Yeah. Okay. Just down the river from Vermont Yankee is the Vernon Dam. One of the properties owned by TransCanada that's up for sale. Another one up in the Bellows Falls community. You reported on Thursday about the working group here in the state of Vermont putting out a report saying we don't recommend Vermont move forward trying to buy these, basically withdrawing, even saying we shouldn't even partner with somebody right now, a private entity, to work with buying these. Is that decision strictly about money? Were there other practicalities involved in that report that said, yeah, this is a bad idea for the state, or was it all financial?
I mean, certainly money was part of the equation. TransCanada, the estimate is that these dams could be worth over $1 billion. That's why I think the state pretty much a few months into this process ruled out an outright purchase. Part of the problem was timing, too. TransCanada is looking to unload these dams pretty quickly. I think by the end of the year, they want an agreement in place. And the state just doesn't work that way. The legislature was out of session, earlier this year. There's some funding in place for a study. But as far as putting together any sort of partnership package or any sort of bid in any way, they just felt there just wasn't enough time to do it.
Yeah, well, and quotes I read in that story on Thursday, as well as other reports I've read on this, I'm not sure how much support there was for state ownership to begin with. I mean, it's something like, yeah, okay, we're going to go through the process. We're going to look at it because some people think this is worth exploring. And certainly it was worth exploring, but I didn't necessarily glean a whole lot of support, even in that working group, for the idea of, yeah, Vermont should be buying these dams.
Yeah, this was a really strange thing to cover in that regard because initially back in April, there was all this enthusiasm. We missed an opportunity when the dams were for sale, a decade, 12 years ago, whatever it was. Now we've got this opportunity. We're really going to look at this. And then not much.
Right.
You know, and
Okay, we'll form a working group. It seemed like, a decade ago there was more momentum for this than there was this time.
And, I'm sure that there are folks, especially within the Shumlin administration, that would dispute this. But, there's some legislators especially who say, Oliver Olson, our own Oliver Olson being one of them, that the outcome here was basically preordained. This was a formality.
Right.
We're going to look at it, but we're not serious about it.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly what it seemed like. But they've moved on from it now. Do we know at this point, does TransCanada have any serious buyers? Is this just kind of something in limbo? I think they kind of need to make this sale in order to do what they want to do down in Texas with the gas pipeline that they planned.
Yeah. They've already closed on the purchase of that company down there. So something like, what is it, $13 billion, something like that. The numbers are just amazing. TransCanada, this has been a very closed process, and one of the problems that the state had is that they being the state officials, they weren't even willing to sign a confidentiality agreement that would have given them access to all of TransCanada's bid documents, because they felt that, well, first of all, there's public records concerns, and second of all, it would have prohibited them from talking with other potential partners in the process. So even at the state level, there is not a lot of familiarity with where TransCanada is. And when I've asked them about it, they've basically said, we're not going to talk about it except to say we want to have this done in relatively short order.
Yeah, all right. So we'll have to wait for an announcement from the folks at TransCanada about that. Mike Faher, tell the listeners out there some of the stories you're working on this week that they can find in all the different media outlets that you provide service for.
Well, there was a Vermont nuclear decommissioning citizens advisory panel meeting late last week that there'll be some news coverage from. Planning to go up on the I-91 bridge site actually today and talk with those folks about how that project is going. So that's some of the things I'm working on.
Yeah, well, always keeping you busy. Always appreciate your updates here on the show. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
All right, Mike Faher. Find his writing on VTDigger.org, commonsnews.org, and in the pages and online for the Brattleboro Reformer, your hometown daily newspaper, online at reformer.com. Back to wrap up this edition of Green Mountain Mornings right after these messages.